With the fixed exchange rate system, in response to a rise in exports, the size of the pie rises to achieve equilibrium, as shown here. The relative share of the pie spent on imports remains the same, but the size of the slice grows as the pie grows. Alternatively, under the floating exchange rate system, we have monetary independence so that the pie remains the same size. Imports grow to equal exports by taking a larger slice of the pie. That is, the economy experiences globalisation, where the additional income from exports is offset with a reduction in the income from domestic sales. Therefore, the real choice for economies considering the merits of the fixed and the floating exchange rate systems is between a system that grows the economic pie and a system that keeps the pie the same size. Hi, I'm Lee Harkness, and in this video we will be investigating why the floating exchange rate system has reduced the rate of economic growth in countries that have adopted the system. That outcome was considered in my last video, a link to which is available in the description. The first reason I will consider for the slow rate of economic growth is what Milton Friedman called internal monetary independence. Milton Friedman was a notable advocate of the floating exchange rate system. He wrote in his essay on the case for flexible exchange rates that, in effect, flexible exchange rates are a means of combining interdependence among countries through trade with a maximum of internal monetary independence. They are a means of permitting each country to seek for monetary stability according to its own lights, without either imposing its mistakes on its neighbours or having their mistakes imposed on it. As Milton Friedman highlighted, one of the characteristics of the floating exchange rate system is internal monetary independence. That is, with the floating exchange rate system, international transactions do not affect the domestic money supply. This is because, on the foreign exchange market, the amount of money being spent buying foreign currency must equal the amount of money being earned from the sale of foreign currency. The market is a place where domestic money is traded for foreign currency, and vice versa. It is a system that ensures that international payments and receipts are equal in terms of domestic currency. Milton Friedman asserts that internal monetary independence is an attribute of the floating exchange rate system because it prevents countries from imposing their mistakes on their neighbours and their neighbours from imposing their mistakes on them. For example, assume a country A, using the floating exchange rate system, has national income of $100 billion, made up of $80 billion from production for the domestic economy and $20 billion from exports. Now assume that its trading partners make a mistake that drive their economies into a recession. As a result, they reduce their imports from country A from 20 billion to 10 billion, as shown here. Under the floating exchange rate system, the reduced availability of foreign currency on the foreign exchange market would deflate the value of the currency, making imports more expensive. Spending on imports would fall from 20 billion to 10 billion, and the remaining 10 billion that was spent on imports would now be spent on domestic products. Therefore, total national income would remain the same. National income would now be made up of exports of 10 billion and 90 billion from products sold to the domestic economy. In this example, we can see that the mistakes of the trading partners were not imposed on country A. If the exchange rate in country A had been fixed, the outcome would have been different. The spending on imports would have remained at 20 billion, and there would not have been the shift to increase production for the domestic economy to compensate for the lower exports. The reduction in export income would have reduced the amount of money in the economy and caused widespread recession. Therefore, we can see that the fixed exchange rate system does not give a country internal monetary independence, nor protection from their neighbours' mistakes. What Milton Friedman forgot to mention was that internal monetary independence also means that the floating exchange rate system prevents countries from prospering from their neighbours' good fortune. One of the major benefits of trade prevented by the floating exchange rate system is the prosperity associated with the growth of international trade. Under fixed exchange rates, when exports increase, the country's income increases also, and more money flows into the economy. This makes the country more prosperous, but the floating exchange rate system prevents this from happening. It ensures internal monetary independence, and that means economies lose the economic growth and prosperity they otherwise would have gained through international trade under fixed exchange rates. To explain this effect, let us assume that country A has a floating exchange rate system, and this time its exports rise by $10 billion, from $20 billion to $30 billion. Internal monetary independence under the floating exchange rate system means that no additional money flows into the economy from the rise in exports. Instead, the increased supply of foreign currency on the foreign exchange market drives up the value of domestic currency in terms of foreign currency. That makes imports cheaper, so that domestic spending shifts from domestic products to imports. That reduces the demand for domestic products. Therefore, while exports may have increased by $10 billion, production for the domestic economy has declined by $10 billion. Domestic expenditure has shifted from domestic products to raise the now cheaper imports by $10 billion. The net effect is that national income has remained constant despite the rise in export income. If country A had been using the fixed exchange rate system, the $10 billion increase in exports would have increased national income, as shown here. Most of the time, exports and imports are growing in the world. Internal monetary independence means the loss of the additional income that would have been derived from international trade. It is one of the main reasons why the rate of economic growth has declined in countries that have adopted the floating exchange rate system. That effect, inhibiting economic growth, is quite immediate, as shown in the following chart for the United States of America. This chart shows the annualized quarterly growth rate for the United States of America for 2 years either side of the time when it floated its currency, that is, around March 1973. The annualized quarterly growth rates shown in this chart are the quarterly rates raised to the fourth power. For comparison, I have added a line for the annual growth rates. This is calculated as the growth in GDP in a quarter relative to the same quarter 12 months earlier. Immediately after the float, we can see that the rate of economic growth declined dramatically, that is, in the second quarter of 1973. That decline is the effect of adopting the floating exchange rate system. It is the same effect that we saw in other countries in the previous video. In the third quarter of 1973, the rate of economic growth in the United States dropped below zero, and the economy dipped into a recession. The Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, met on the 16th of October 1973 and announced that they were raising oil prices from $3.01 US to $5.12 US per barrel, and that oil exports would be restricted to support that price. It was following that announcement that the national accounts data was released, revealing that the economy was in recession in the third quarter of 1973. In the hysteria of that time, that recession, together with the subsequent recessions, became known as the oil crisis. The initial recession occurred after the float, but before the OPEC meeting. Therefore, it may have been more appropriate for economists to have called that recession the floating fiasco. The floating exchange rate system had eliminated one of the main benefits of trade, that is, the prosperity gained from raising exports. The elimination of the trade multiplier is another related and significant cause of the reduction in the rate of economic growth following the adoption of the floating exchange rate system. To explain what the trade multiplier is, let us consider country A again, this time with fixed exchange rates. In this economy, people and businesses earn $100 billion per cycle, $80 billion from the sale of products to the domestic economy, and $20 billion from exports. A cycle is the amount of time it takes for all the income earned in the economy to be spent once. At current prices, they spend 80% of their income on domestic products and the remaining 20% on imports. This economy is said to be in equilibrium because income and expenditure are the same, and the expenditure on imports is equal to the income from exports. There is no pressure to change. As before, we assume an increase in exports adds $10 billion to export income and national income, which rises from $100 billion to $110 billion. However, to explain the trade multiplier effect, we will identify the new exports separately, as shown on this chart. People not only earn money, they spend it. We noted earlier that in this economy with fixed exchange rates, 80% of spending was on domestic products. Now, when people come to spend the additional $10 billion of income they earned from the growth of exports, they will spend 80% or $8 billion on domestic products. The remaining 20% of the additional income, or $2 billion, would be spent on imports. That money is lost to the economy and goes to raise the incomes of the suppliers of those imports. When we assess the income of the economy now, we not only have the original level of production for the domestic economy, we have the additional $8 billion of production generated by the additional demand from income earned from the increased exports. On top of that, we have the original level of exports of $20 billion. Then on top of that again, we have the new exports of $10 billion. Country A had started with income of $100 billion. The increased exports of $10 billion had raised that to $110 billion. When that $110 billion is spent, it raises the demand for domestic products from $80 billion to $88 billion. Now with exports at $30 billion, total national income has risen to $118 billion. That increase in national income from $110 billion to $118 billion is part of the trade multiplier effect. With fixed exchange rates, not only do the exports raise national income, there are flow-on or multiplier effects that raise national income even further. When that $118 billion is spent, it too will raise incomes even more, as we will see in the next period. In the next expenditure cycle, the original expenditure on domestic products is the original income from the sale of domestic products to the domestic economy. On top of that, when the additional income of $8 billion earned from the sale of domestic products to exporters is spent, 80% or $6.4 billion is spent on domestic products. Then exporters will spend 80% of their export income in this cycle on domestic products, adding a further $8 billion to the income of domestic producers. The original $20 billion of imports from the original $100 billion of income will continue to be $20 billion. On top of that, 20% of the $8 billion of additional income earned by producers from exporters will be spent on imports, amounting to $1.6 billion. Then finally, the new exporters will spend 20% of their $10 billion of additional income on imports, amounting to $2 billion. Thus, when all the income earned in the previous cycle is spent, we can see that the growth in exports has further raised the incomes of domestic producers, this time from $88 billion to $94.4 billion. When the $30 billion of exports is added, the national income in the next period would be $124.4 billion. While the income from exports is greater than the expenditure on imports, the trade multiplier process will continue, causing the economy to grow. The economy will be in equilibrium and cease to grow when the expenditure on imports is equal to the income from exports. For that to happen, imports would have to grow to $30 billion. That will happen when total expenditure in country A has reached $150 billion. At that level of expenditure, its spending on domestic products would be $120 billion. Its income from exports would continue to be $30 billion, taking its total income to $150 billion. Therefore, under the fixed exchange rate system, we can see that a 50% increase in exports will generate an additional 50% increase in imports, and by doing so, it will generate a 50% increase in national income. As we saw earlier, under the floating exchange rate system, a 50% increase in exports would also generate a 50% increase in imports, but it does so without any increase in national income. There is no multiplier effect. From the analysis so far, we can begin to understand why economies that have replaced the fixed exchange rate system with the floating exchange rate system have had such a dramatic reduction in their rates of economic growth. Another factor that is evident from this analysis is that under the fixed exchange rate system, any increase in export income flows on to increase the income from the sale of domestic products to the domestic economy. In our previous example, shown here, income from domestic sales rose from $80 billion to $120 billion in response to a $10 billion increase in exports. But under the floating exchange rate system, because of monetary independence, any increase in export income causes income from sales to the domestic economy to decline. As we saw in this earlier example, a $10 billion increase in exports in country A caused domestic production for the domestic economy to fall from $80 billion to $70 billion. Also, it's not just exports that increase. Imports also increase by an equivalent amount immediately. This is because the foreign exchange market requires the economy to respond to an increase in export receipts with an increase in import payments of an equivalent amount. That requires the economy to shift its expenditure from domestic products to imports. Therefore, the rise in exports causes a corresponding rise in imports and a reduction in the demand for domestic products. That process raises international trade as a share of the economy. In this last example, international trade rises from 20% to 30% of the economy. That effect is known as globalisation. The globalisation effect is responsible for the decline in import competing industries that has been experienced in countries that have adopted the floating exchange rate system. In the United States of America, for example, in 1972, the year before it floated its currency, imports accounted for 5.8% of gross domestic product. In 2022, 50 years later, imports accounted for 15.4% of the economy. That is 166% higher as a share of gross domestic product. It is this effect that is responsible for what is known as the Rust Belt in the United States of America. Therefore, when we compare the fixed and the floating exchange rate systems, the important consideration in selecting the most suitable system is how these systems achieve equilibrium. Let us look at country A again, this time using a pie diagram to represent national income. 80% of income, or $80 billion, comes from domestic sales and 20% or $20 billion comes from exports. Then we assumed that exports rise from $20 billion to $30 billion. Under the fixed exchange rate system, the additional export income injects additional money into the economy. As we saw earlier, the economy moves towards equilibrium through the multiplier effect by growing the economy, as shown here. When the economy had fully adjusted and attained equilibrium, the 50% increase in exports would have generated a 50% increase in national income. On the other hand, under the floating exchange rate system, equilibrium is attained on the foreign exchange market. The increase in exports drives up the exchange rate to make imports relatively cheaper. That shifts domestic spending from domestic products to imports. The market is cleared when import payments rise to equal export receipts. That means that expenditure on domestic products must decline by an amount corresponding to the increase in imports, as shown here. The dotted line marks the former level of exports and the former level of domestic sales. This is the globalization effect that we saw in the earlier example. So, to summarise, with the fixed exchange rate system, in response to a rise in exports, the size of the pie rises to achieve equilibrium, as shown here. The relative share of the pie spent on imports remains the same, but the size of the slice grows as the pie grows. Alternatively, under the floating exchange rate system, we have monetary independence so that the pie remains the same size. Imports grow to equal exports by taking a larger slice of the pie. That is, the economy experiences globalisation, where the additional income from exports is offset with a reduction in the income from domestic sales. Therefore, the real choice for economies considering the merits of the fixed and the floating exchange rate systems is between a system that grows the economic pie and a system that keeps the pie the same size. It is a choice between an open economy that prospers from international trade and a closed economy that does not. In this video, we have been considering the more technical reasons for why the floating exchange rate system has reduced the rate of economic growth in countries that have adopted the system. In my next video, we will be looking at other factors that have contributed to that reduction in the rate of economic growth.